I was looking, when I was reading about these different stories, I came across some words and I just thought I'd quickly share them. Imagine a world where we as consumers could choose the food we knew was good for us without fear of recrimination or loss of supply. Imagine a world where small family farmers could provide clean, ethically grown food in an economically viable way without fear or recrimination or bank-busting fines. Now those two examples, I think, reflect everything that imagination wants but isn't getting. So our next example, Mark and Helen, back in 2008, they started up a cowshare program as a way of selling raw milk, which they were doing up until about May in 2016, when Mark and Helen Tyler were convicted of selling raw milk by the South Australian government. I'll leave the rest of the story for them to tell. Thanks, Mark.
Try to swallow, eh?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, my wife and I, Helen's over here. We run a dairy farm in South Australia. Got emotional before I came up here, so it wasn't a good start. I think that quote did it to me. So, yeah, I've lived on the farm all my life. Dad bought the place in '58, and it's always been a dairy farm. I'll try and keep close. Okay. Yeah, so we were licensed to sell raw milk back in 2001, 2002. The AFSA came in, Food Standards Australia New Zealand, and I don't know whose story it was, but we were told that, and the politicians were told that the law had to be the same everywhere. So at that stage, South Australia was the only state that allowed raw cow's milk in a regulated system. So we were told that it had to be banned everywhere because under AFSA the same rule had to apply in all jurisdictions. Certainly we found out a lot more since. All the time New Zealand farmers or New Zealand consumers could go to any farmer they liked and get raw milk whenever they wanted, up till last year when they brought in a regulated system. In 4 states, goat's milk's still allowed in Australia, so it's not the same rules everywhere. It was just a way of getting rid of cow's milk. And it's things like that that people don't know. You guys in Victoria probably don't know that goat's milk's allowed in other states, and you need to ask questions to your politicians. Do you say, why do you think that us Victorian farmers are not capable of producing milk safely when other states can? Because Victoria and Tassie are the only states that have it banned. And but it's those irregularities that have been highlighted already, that it's not science that is behind all these decisions. So we stopped selling in early 2003 when the ban started, and the drought was affecting us badly, and we nearly lost the farm. Lots of things happened. We actually ended up early 2008 stopping milking, and we just dried off all the cows. I was working off farm, and it's spring that year we started having cows calving, and the companies had changed the minimum pickup to 600 litres, and we knew we wouldn't get there for ages. They'll pick you up before that if they know you're going to sort of get up to that in 2 weeks, but we wouldn't get there for months. And in the meantime, I sort of had the thought, why can I drink this milk and no one else can? It's because I own these cows. So it's like a God-given idea to set up the cowshare program. And then as I researched, I saw it was available, that cowshares were happening in America. So we sort of looked at some different models and set it up. And it just grew by word of mouth. We never advertised. Started off just running around with an esky delivering the milk, and it's just, I suppose before I move on, late 2008 we got a letter from the dairy authority saying, oh, we've heard that you're selling milk and blah blah blah, and I rang them and explained what we're doing, said I'd love to set up a regulated system with you again, and the head of the dairy authority said, well, I'll have to take that to the board. Never heard from them till 13th of May 2013. I had 6 officers from biosecurity, dairy authority and police officer just come into the dairy while I was milking. I said, well, I'm milking the cows, can you come back later? And they said, no, it's not possible. So I just said, well, you're going to have to wait till I finish milking. And I didn't know this, but they went back into the other part of the dairy and just walked around taking photos, going through all our cupboards and everything. Finished milking, they wanted to see some paperwork, so I go into the house with them following, and daughter's cooking in the kitchen, and she just sees all these guys come in, guys and girls. Anyway, they were accusing us of running an unaccredited dairy, and yeah, we've got to try and speed up the story. Yeah, it was just out of the blue this happened, and we've since found out that they were hiring private investigators to watch our farm to prove that we're milking cows, and I don't know, it's that hard really, but yeah, so we appealed that decision, and sort of lots of processes and that, went to the district court. I just defended ourselves and we won because the law said that we weren't required to be accredited, so that was our first victory. In the meantime, the government tried to stop that. They brought 3 criminal charges against us, so we had to go through the magistrate's court, and I defended us there again. Magistrate's decision went against us on 2 of those charges, because we'd already covered the unaccredited dairy one. And yeah, so we ended up appealing that decision, but while we're on the timeline, that night after the magistrate's decision, just another God-given idea, I just thought, well, if charging a boarding fee is a sale of milk, then we won't charge anything. So we just sent out an email saying we're not going to charge anything anymore. If you want to put a donation in our bank account, here it is. And that's how we've been operating ever since. The Dairy Authority. So we didn't tell anyone that we'd changed how we were operating. We just kept supplying milk to the people that needed it. And so a month later, because all of this happened, like I said, we never heard anything from the Dairy Authority for like 6 years. There was a change in the Dairy Authority, but because I'm not under their system, I didn't know that had happened, and the new guy got a bee in his bonnet and thought he'd get brownie points, and so that's where it all started. And so he sent me an email to say, oh, we've changed the regulations, but what they brought in was that anyone that produced milk for commercial purposes must be accredited, and because we're giving it away, we didn't come under it anyway, so we'd already dodged the bullet before we knew it was coming. And so yeah, we kept operating. We ended up having the court case shown to be a mistrial. There's lots of things that they did wrong, but in the Supreme Court, the judge made one comment about raw milk being a sham, which meant that in a retrial it would have got nowhere unless we went to the High Court, and we just don't have the money to fight that. And also, because we'd changed how we're operating, we're not here to defend cow share, we're here to see raw milk available, and so the fight wasn't over that anyway. So yeah, so that's the story, and sort of I just thought, how would a legal defence fund have helped us? And I mean, initially there would be an advice line that you could say we're setting up the cow share, you could get that advice in. When we had these guys turn up on the door, I got no idea what my rights are. I tend to be polite and take people at face value, so I probably allowed them to do things that they didn't have the right to do. But if we had that legal defence fund, I could have made a phone call right there and then. And I mean, I've been fortunate to defend ourselves. It hasn't cost us much. Probably I made some mistakes, but my early experience was that I would have spent twice as long explaining all the stuff to lawyers than I would have just doing it myself. But not everyone has that ability, and a legal defence fund will just provide that facility to those that need it. So it is extremely important that that we get this thing up and running. It's not going to look like the American model straight away. We don't have the population, but we've got to start somewhere, and we've got to get this thing happening. And I mean, if what we've been through helps get this happening so that farmers can be protected in the future, then it's a great thing. How much time we got? Just a few comments. Like, I mean, Joel talked about this man bringing his wife to his door, and that just reminded me of a story. That's the advantage with us supplying direct to the customers. We hear their stories, and like one young couple, I think she would have been in her mid-20s. She's about as tall as me, and she was 37 kilos. Body was rejecting every food, and they came, they'd heard about raw milk, said, we want to get this, and so how do we do it? And her health completely turned around. She's a fit, healthy young lady now, and there's people with autoimmune disease. There's videos online of a lady telling her story of her son's autism reversing in 6 months, where he went from not able to communicate at all to being in a normal school in that length of time. And so you hear those stories, and I mean, we had authorities come in again in November, December, and I have to remind Helen of those stories sometimes, that this is why we want to keep going. And another comment, I can't remember who said something, but this lines up with about it not being about health at all, that after we pleaded guilty and got our $18,000 fine or whatever it was, I rang the Director of Public Health and said, do you have a problem with us giving milk away? And he said, no, but we would have a problem if you were seen to make a living out of giving milk away. And that, like, he's going to forever rue saying those words, because it just shows it's not about health. If it was about health, they wouldn't want me giving it to anyone. But it's all about business. And I think Joe spoke about the farmer representatives that the NFF and other organisations have. We've had representatives that have said comments on the radio like, oh, it's safe for the farmers to drink but not safe for people in the cities. Well, I don't know if it self-destructs when it crosses a boundary fence or what happens, but if I can produce a product that's safe for my family to drink, I can produce a product that's safe for anybody to drink. And so we're committed to seeing this regulated. We've seen some positives happening recently in our local authority there in SA, and so hopefully, well, with us just keeping talking sense, I mean, we're not saying leave us alone, and we're just saying we want a regulated system, and yeah, there's potential problems with that, but they can keep changing the rules like they have with Elgaar Farms, and but we've got to work towards the goal that we want. Lastly, this is another brainchild of mine that maybe some of you guys can help with. And it's been talked about here today. Apart from legal issues, the other side is finance is a big problem for people that are producing food in an alternative way. I mean, back in the 90s, we bought the family farm and the banks said, oh, we'll give you all the money you want if you're going to put vines in. And vines are going crazy in SA, especially at that time. It's just ridiculous. And so it's hard if you do something outside of the normal to get money out of banks. And I want to set up a financial institution where consumers especially can put money into it, can get a better return than the banks, but the money can go to people that want to produce food and sell direct to the customer. And part of my vision of that is that instead of having brokers getting 1/4%, 1/4% could go to the Legal Defence Fund. So if anyone's got any ideas, wants to talk to me about setting that up, I reckon it'll be a brilliant idea.
If you can't help but feel these stories aren't here to make us feel bad. These are resilient individuals. Joe and Antonia, Joe and Andrew, Mark and Helen just now, Tammi and Stuart. These are resilient individuals. They've been copping it on the front line for all of us. Yet they're still standing and they're still willing to tell the story, and they're still coming up with innovative ideas that can take this collective momentum into a new direction. Standing in front of the existing isn't going to change it. We just have to build the pathway that we want. And with that energy and momentum, we can, and with structures that give the financial freedom, where we know our money is going to something that we support, not some collective funds that could be going to things we don't agree with. This is, you know, in the wreckage, in the emotional wreckage of that attrition, to still be coming up with ideas is yeah, that's inspiring. And you know what, you tapped on it there, Andrew, because what the farmers and consumers, which means all of us, need is an advocacy focus. And that central sovereignty hub is AFSA, is becoming AFSA, the Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance. And